Welcome back to this Monday edition of Freight Waves, and I'm Anthony Smith here alongside Thomas Watson. And Thomas, we have Tyler Cole here with us, who's going to join us for this segment for Net Zero Carbon, brought to you by Convoy. Tyler, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Happy Monday, y'all. How you doing?
Doing well. Excited to have you on, and we're talking about an interesting trend here, and that's extreme weather and its impact on the supply chains. Let's jump into it.
Guys, get ready. It's only going to get worse from here. We're living in the age of disruption. We're responding to a couple articles that I saw this past week in the New York Times and the Washington Post just around, higher counts of tornadoes last March, setting a record compared to, I think, 2017 was the latest tornado record that we had. So we're looking at a few events in March that were really volatile, really violent, caused a lot of damage, loss of life. But it's an interesting conversation that we get to have, and I hope y'all jump in here and ask a few good questions, because you can be on two sides of the fence as I see it. We either are in an age where we are seeing climate change as a result of human-caused activities, or we are also in an age where we're not seeing more, we just see more. It's not that we have an actual increase in volatility in events, it's that we now have the tools to better capture and manage and look back at data and history as opposed to 40, 50 years ago. So I'm curious where you guys sit kind of on that fence, because there are two kind of competing ideas of thought. And I'm not a climatologist or a meteorologist. I defer to Nick Austin probably more than most people. But it's an interesting conversation that we get to have, because one, we know there's disruption happening, but two, we can argue about why and how much, right?
I think that's a great thought experiment, especially understanding the impact of climate. One of the statistics was 1 in 3 Americans say they've been personally affected by an extreme weather event in the last 2 years, according to a Gallup poll released on Wednesday. 1 in 3 is kind of wild. I mean, I'm kind of leaning towards, like you said, we're getting more awareness of it. And I guess maybe in the past, if a village just kind of disappeared, do you think that it's, how do you think are some of the ways we can even begin to tackle some of these issues, like higher rates for tornado-prone areas, perhaps?
That's definitely an idea. Let's put that to the test real quick, though. There's 3 of us talking here. Which one of us would you say you've been impacted by an extreme weather event in the last 2 years, personally? I'll put my hand up. Either of y'all? Maybe?
Yeah, not me. I mean, when I look at this, it's one of those things where I think to myself of, if it hasn't happened to you, you might just kind of brush us off. And then the moment something like this does happen to you, it's all that much more real, or someone close to you. I know not too long ago, we had tornadoes here that ran through Chattanooga. Before then, I've never really been a part of anything like that or seen the aftermath or the effects of it. And so knowing that I've had people that were, close to me, some friends, some associates that went through some of those hardships, made it that much real for me, as opposed to, spending so much of my time in Brooklyn, New York, or in the Arizona area, is not as real. But once I start to see, I'm like, okay, this is impactful here.
Exactly. And I would be the same. I had family that were in the Nashville tornadoes a couple years ago that were impacted. And those memories stick with you, right? We have a recency bias, and we have an extreme tendency, I would say, to recall the worst events, like to polarize our experiences, right, in the worst and the best. And you talking about very different regions of the country, Anthony. In the Northeast, you're going to see different extreme weather than you're going to see out west with the wildfires that we've seen recently. And here in the South, where you see much wetter conditions and potential for more tornadoes like we have seen. But, what was the stat? 210 tornadoes in March of 22 compared to 192 in 2017. Some of those that we're tracking are not necessarily the F5s, right? Like, those are the ones people remember, right? We're tracking a lot of these smaller tornadoes. And the good part about that is, as we do improve modeling, as we do improve sensors, as we do wrap our brain around how we mitigate these risks, we're seeing less loss of lives overall, compared to years past. And that's globally, right? Disaster preparedness has been a big focus of governments, especially, right? Because when we're having to constantly clean up messes, we're not able to grow our economy and see our populations thrive, right? So we want to make sure that we're building in areas that are not prone to natural disasters. We want to make sure we're getting, warnings out so people can evacuate areas before hurricanes and things like that hit. And as it relates to supply chain, I think we've seen these disruptions happen in the past, and I can't say with certainty that we're going to see more of them happen in the future. In fact, it's probably less. I think as we do see climate change impacts, possibly increase, volatility of extreme weather events, I think we have the tools where we can now plan for that and we can build around that. And that doesn't mean it's perfect. You're still having to accept risk, but you will see things like, Thomas just mentioned, if we see corridors, certain parts of the year where they're prone in March to tornadoes, carriers should be tracking that and understanding they don't want to put their drivers' lives at risk if there's a chance of a storm. So, plug for sonar. As you're planning your routes, get in there and throw up the radar and try to be alert when you're accepting your loads for the next week. It's a tool that we have that we didn't have 5 years ago that could help you plan your business to avoid consequences from climate, right?
I think it's a great point. Understanding and paying attention to weather is huge. I remember in my carrier days, I always love a situation where if we have the visibility and we can finally tell the customer, hey, the reason your time critical shipment is shut down is because I-80 is shut down due to high winds. Here's the exact location. I have the telematics. I can prove this. Then it goes a long way towards kind of communicating versus a customer thinking, oh, they're just late again, or I'm going to get angry. Interesting thought. And this is what I'm thinking of in terms of how important the weather is going to be. We talk about recent trends with autonomous trucking. Research talked about that. If they cannot account for driving and weather, maybe only 10 to 15% of the U.S. is really favorable, like the Sun Belt, versus the rest of the country. Do you think that may be something that a lot of folks haven't really paid attention to in terms of how technology and weather are going to be playing a huge role in the coming years?
I think so. And it's the interplay of a lot of different technologies and new business models that you're really talking about there that are worth exploring. We can rely on human intuition and memory and expertise when we've got that driver behind the wheel who's been through that storm, who knows what's safe and knows his limits. When you're out there trying to build a model that simulates that and that thinks through that same scenario, you just got to pack it with that much more data and be able to figure out how you account for that value judgment or that feeling, that gut feel that the driver has, right? I think you're going to end up seeing, if you have to programmatically tell a truck what to do, you would see the truck default to a shutdown mode, right? Rather than try to power through it, is what I would hope. And that's why we've got a lot of people involved in this environment, specifically around autonomy, at understanding, when and where is it safe and appropriate to release these technologies into the wild, and how many hours of research and testing do we need to have done before you and I would feel safe driving through a storm with these type of trucks on the road? I'll tell you, I'm not there today. I don't think the general public is there and has that comfort level today to look up in the middle of an ice storm and see no one behind the wheel. So I don't know how we account for that. I know that I'm grateful that there's top tier engineers and talent and regulators that are looking at this and trying to solve the problem of driver shortages and employing technology to try and improve our supply chains. And I'm grateful they're also taking into account safety, because that's the number one goal, especially if you're a fleet operator. You cannot sacrifice safety in any form or fashion. So, as weather models change, I doubt that that's really high on the people designing these systems to try and incorporate real-time climate change events. We need to see histories of seasonality before we start changing our weather models, right? And I'm sure Nick could speak to that way more intelligently than I could.
Erlene, it is great. I think it was a great insight as well, talking about the different weather variances. I know we started off with tornadoes, but looking at the New England Northeast area, I know during my time in Boston, some impressive snowstorms that I've had to kind of go through, and probably shouldn't have driven in some of those as well, but in some of the wildfires, of course, in the Southwest. As we continue to move forward, of course, that mindset of doing better and being more efficient and reducing greenhouse gases is a huge part of the supply chain. Can you talk about potentially that mindset, that snowball mindset that can go either way of, hey, I'm going to do more, I'm going to be a little bit more proactive, I'm going to try to be a little bit of a change, versus that other mindset that I know starts to eat at myself sometimes when I'm thinking about, is this going to make a difference if I go recycle this? Am I really going to make a difference? I'm not going to stop anything. Can you talk to a little bit of that snowballing mindset that can really kind of go either way here?
Yeah, it's an unfortunate gray area you got to get comfortable living in, because I don't think it's safe to reside on either extreme of that spectrum. Personal action matters, but true systemic change comes from policy changes. And not just, any one local, regional, city, or federal level. Like, it's global attention to these issues that we need to be paying attention to. So you got to get comfortable living that nuance. You got to educate yourself. If we're bringing this back to supply chains and fleet managers and transportation managers, you need to run a risk model and assign an economic value to the potential risk that you have from weather event, from climate change, whether that's looking at your network and determining where you want to source from or where you want to build a new DC. If you are trying to reduce greenhouse gases by shortening your supply chain and getting rid of total miles traveled, that's an important decision. But you've got to consider, if you're wanting to, take advantage of low-cost labor, are you also putting yourself at climate risk or potentially not having resiliency in your network? Because if there is a hurricane or a tornado in this part of the world, where am I going to get my next product from? And how do we make sure that our employees and our people that we're working with are safe? And, evaluating it that way. Personally, if you bring it back from, business side, it's a value judgment at the end of the day, right? I personally don't know that my recycling does a whole lot, but I know that it's a habit that if I break it, it's going to be really hard to start again. So I'm kind of trusting that I'm going to just keep getting better one day at a time and hope that everybody else is doing the same and that there's policies that, cause real lasting change on the back end of that.
And I'm really interested to see, there was a good quote here. Climate experts say that governments have not spent enough time or money preparing for climate disasters and that there's a limit to how much the country and the world can adapt. It continues, if nations don't move quickly enough to cut greenhouse gas emissions, which drive the climate change, experts say they'll find themselves at the edges of resilience. I know that the climate scientists say this may be an issue of resilience, but have we seen some resiliency already in terms of like Hurricane Ida when that came in? Technology came, we were able to at least predict the storm path better with newer models. When we talk about resiliency, are we on a scale of like 0, which is we totally got this, or 10, we have no idea? Is it, because it feels to me like a lot of climate experts are going to say, oh, it's a 10, we're all doom and gloom. I mean, how does one casually try to approach this when they're trying to make a good decision like, do I need to live in a hurricane zone or something like that?
That's a personal value judgment you got to make. You're right. People on both extremes of the conversation will say we're either at a 10 or we're at a 0. The reality is I think we're way better than average, right? And you can look at a lot of these numbers. We're pointing at increasing like tornado counts and volatile weather events on a average basis increasing, but we're seeing death counts go down, which tells us that we're more prepared, that we are investing in situations where we can react from these events happening. Doesn't mean it's perfect. And at the end of the day, if it's like a Pareto principle in most things, if you spend all your money on being fully resilient, that's probably not the best use of capital. And even take it personally, like raising a kid. Like I'm never going to prevent all the bad things in the world from happening to my kid. I can't build a bubble around my supply chain or my family as much as you would like to. But you have to allow natural events to kind of play their course. We want to impact them however we can and make smart decisions and prepare not only our supply chains, but our families and ourselves, to operate well in this world. But we're never going to be able to perfectly control the environment. No matter what. So I would say that I'm optimistic that we have invested. If you believe the worst case trends that we are headed for, blowing past our carbon budget in the next 20 years, and we're going to see just a world ending type storms. I don't know how you prepare for that without shutting down the economy like we did last year. And you've seen how quickly we've bounced back from those low emissions numbers during COVID. Just because the world wants to keep thriving and growing. We want to see economies grow and people thrive. We want to lift up the poorest out of poverty. We want to continue to make goods and services, but we're going to have to just deal with weather events and make your best case value judgments on where you place those resiliency dollars, as you were talking about, Thomas.
I think you bring up a lot of great points there. As we're looking forward to the next episode of Net Zero Carbon, what do you have on tap there?
Oh, we got some good ones coming up, y'all. We've got Jason from DHL coming out this week talking about their North American supply chain focus, how they're working on greening that operation. And then, we've got the Earth Day Summit next week, Net Zero Carbon Summit. We've got Convoy sponsoring it. We've got, I think, 10 or 12 panelists coming in from regulators to industry operators, fleets, shippers, coalitions that are looking to buy green freight. It's going to be one that the listeners should check out for sure.
Perfect, Tyler. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Looking forward to it, and especially looking forward to that virtual event as well. We'll be sure to plug it as it continues to approach. We'll be sure to check in with you next week.